Gamebryo has a sophisticated rendering system, but you'll do most of your programming at a higher level. Emergent provides application frameworks as prototypes for complete applications. Here's a list of the Gamebryo application framework libraries and their dependencies. The two principal framework libraries are NI-application and NI-sample. As you can see, NI-sample is an extension of NI-application that takes advantage of some of the other utility libraries as well. If you look in the Gamebryo distribution on disk, you'll see NI-entity in there as well. That interfaces with the Scene Designer tool and is part of the entity-based approach to gameplay programming that we'll be talking about at length in this video tutorial series. So we'll deal with that in another segment. NI-metrics output, off by itself at the bottom, mostly comes up when you're doing performance tuning, which we're not covering here. NI-application is a basic, platform-independent application wrapper. It handles all of the tasks necessary to start up a Gamebryo application. Whatever window creation your platform requires, setting up the renderer, setting up the input system so that you can read the keyboard or the mouse or the gamepad, processing command line arguments, tracking the frame rate, and providing a skeleton main loop. All of these are virtual functions that can be overridden as necessary or modified, and there are further hooks into the system for some commonly altered subsets of these functions. With all of this provided for you, a new Gamebryo application can be up and running very quickly. Give it a couple of models to load, tie the input system to moving a camera or moving a model, and you should have pixels on the screen. To get started with NI application, you'd probably go to override create scene. Create scene builds or loads objects into the scene graph that's going to be used. A trivial example is on screen right now. We create a stream to load data off of disk, give it the file name world.nif, passing it through a utility function that does whatever platform-independent work is necessary to turn that file name into a complete path, load that stream, and if the stream load is successful, assume that what we want to render is the first object in that stream. This is very, very simplistic. In many of the demos and full demos that ship with Gamebryo, you'll see more complicated work in create scene. For example, Metal Wars reaches into that stream that's loaded by the NIF and looks for specifically named objects and assigns different pointers to those, does different pre-processing on different objects in the NIF. This is one of those places where the programmers and the artists have to communicate so that the artists know how to label things in the NIF that the programmers are going to work with. You don't really have to worry about calling the base class version of create scene because it just builds an empty scene graph. NI application uses the NI input library to sample keyboard, mouse, and controller input every frame. You can override process input to respond to this data. You can read the documentation about NI input and its API if you want to do something fancy, but for simple applications, just do the sort of approach that you'll see in this sample code. Place some code that reads the input, checks to see if particular keys were pressed during the last frame. In the case of the example on the screen, if W is pressed, move forward. Hey, you're 3/4 of the way to your first-person shooter control scheme. Here, you do want to call the base class version. That will catch escape as a way of quitting your application. Okay, you might want to override that. And that will process visual tracker input. We'll talk about the visual tracker in a future segment. Update frame is NI application's core main loop. NI application update frame will call process input, calculates the application frame rate for that visual tracker, and doesn't do much else. If you have any animated objects in your scene graph, your application's update frame will want to update them to make sure their animations are appropriate for this new frame, and perhaps do some rendering work. NI sample is an extension of NI application that is used in all of the Gamebryo demos and tutorials. It builds some sophisticated navigation controllers that you can just grab to get normal camera flying, mouse look type interfaces, camera orbiting object type interfaces, and puts words, checkboxes, sliders, other simple widgets on screen. For commercial projects, people often use Scaleform or Anarch. For academic projects, we've had many people having success with Crazy Eddie GUI package, which is open source and free. But here's the NI user interface example of most of our widgets. There's a UI manager class that provides standard components, and you can bring these up on screen. Since all of the samples use them, there's lots of code you can look at to see how this works.